June, Jane, G, K, Raj, and Ray.
Table is available to purchase as well. So if everybody could please give Mary Beth Pfeiffer a round of applause. We are very lucky to have her.
I'm not here, by the way, to sell a book. By the way, I make no money on my book. I'm here to sell a message. That's what I like to say. And I'm sort of the amateur in this lineup so far. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a medical professional. I'm a journalist. And I sort of become an expert over a period of time in researching a lot of different topics. So I will tell you a little bit about that as we go along.
Thank you.
So, let's start with what this epidemic isn't. It's not what you may think, and more appropriately, it's not what a lot of doctors think because of the information they've been given. It isn't managed well. We're not doing much to prevent the illness as well as to diagnose and treat it. It isn't small, and Lord knows it is not under control. We have a long way to go. So first I'm going to frame the problem, starting with the U.S. And you're going to see a lot of these squiggly lines. The general trend is going to be up. And in the U.S., we've gone from about 17,000 cases in 2000 to about 43,000 in 2017. And as you probably know, the Centers for Disease Control says every one reported, there's probably 10. So we're talking about 400,000 cases in 2017. It's also climbing to the north of us in Canada. These are the latest numbers for Canada, where from 2016 to 17, it actually went up 100%. It doubled. Again, now we're getting a little closer to home. It's rising in New York, 2016 to 17, up 32% 1 year alone. Okay. And of course, we have to consider that, we're reporting about 9,800 cases in New York in 2017. Multiply that by 10, and we're nearly at 100,000 cases. Now, it's rising here. We're getting much closer to home. Rising in Newberry County. And again, that steep upward curve going through 2017. And now let's look at other area counties. It's going up all around you. Not quite as steeply as in Erie, which is that green line, but nonetheless, the trend is up. Now, so we've gone kind of from the huge to the local. Now we're just going to step out a little bit again. And we're going to see that, as Dr. Garado mentioned, it's also going up in the central New York area, in the western, the southern tier and so forth. We're in western New York. This is central New York. So again, you see those numbers rising. But the difference that you see is those numbers are measured in the hundreds. That's the scale there. For you, the scale is more in the tens. And this is going to be just a little bit of a theme of my talk, in that while you have lower numbers than your folks to the south, and certainly in the Hudson Valley, the trend is moving upward. You can expect to see your numbers start to change in scale. They have changed a lot, simply in the last 10 years, as we can see. So, why are they changing? You have ticks. You have ticks that are infected with Lyme disease, as well as other things. And one of the best things that the New York State Department of Health has done in recent years is to go out and in almost every county of New York and collect ticks. They're up to about 24,000 ticks that they've collected. So I use that data here to tell you what the infection rates are for you locally. And we're seeing in Erie County highest numbers of Lyme disease, but also the highest rate of infected ticks with Lyme disease. So we're seeing it sort of hover from about 25% in Tennessee to over 50% in Erie. And Lyme, of course, is the leader. This is why we have 83% of tick-borne illnesses are Lyme disease. But we're also seeing other infections. We're seeing anaplasma, we're seeing babesia. Not too much of it locally, but give it time. So a scientist at Drexel University who read my book called it as macabre as a Stephen King horror novel, except it's not a novel, it's true. We have these ticks moving around the planet and biting us, causing all sorts of problems. Now, one of the issues here, and I think this is particular to or relevant to the issue of you have these lower numbers of Lyme cases, is you have lower density of ticks in that huge amount of data that the State Health Department put out based on these 24,000 ticks. They tell us how many ticks there are in a given portion of property. I think these are done on the by the 100 square meter. Dr. Gordo, you may know. I know you were doing 1,000 square meter. But what they found though is that in the blue is the central New York counties, and the red is our local counties in western New York. And you see that, there's a lot more ticks there in central New York than there are here. So they're finding more ticks per acre than we're finding here locally. But again, this is something that is probably destined to change as ticks continue to migrate, move mostly northward as well as westward. And this is a map of Lyme disease incidence per 100,000 population in a relatively recent 3-year period. And what we're seeing over time is basically we have this real kind of center of activity for Lyme disease in the Hudson Valley, in the south. And what we're seeing is it's moving up the Hudson River corridor, it's moving to the west. In the southern tier, like you see rates of 127 per 100,000. Not too long ago, we were seeing rates of under 10 per 100,000. So that's the trend. We're moving up, and we're moving up pretty fast. So, just for a moment, I want to talk about the title of my book, The First Epidemic of Climate Change. I decided that Lyme disease is the first epidemic of climate change. That was my conclusion, and I think I can pretty well defend it. Climate change is abetting other diseases on the planet. There's more cholera, there's more dengue fever, there's more malaria. But those are things we've had for thousands of years. There's also more West Nile virus, which is something that is relatively new. But bar none, there's no other disease that has come to the fore now in the era of climate change that is bigger and more global and expansive and with greater implications than Lyme disease. And there's a lot of evidence that tells us that ticks can survive in places they could not before. But just to put a little kind of point to this, I don't contend that climate change has invented Lyme disease. Lyme disease has been around for a very long time. As many of you may know, there was a hunter-gatherer found encased in a glacier in the Italian Alps about 20 years ago, and he was found to have Lyme disease in his system. Well, let's go back even further. Here on the left, we have a tick encased in amber. And a very lucky scientist named George Pointer from the University of Oregon went to the Dominican Republic about 20 years ago, bought this big hunk of amber, hoping to find some secrets within it, and lo and behold, he finds a tick that looks very similar to our ticks of today. That shows you how long ticks have been around. And you know, the longer a species exists, the better it is at surviving. But what did George do? He put the tick under an electron microscope, and there on the right, he found this coiled bacteria that we now consider to be the first evidence of Borrelia. So these two creatures, Borrelia and the tick, have had a really long time to work out the kinks in their relationship, and they are very good at what they do. So on that question of climate change and how it is abetting and moving this disease around the planet, you know, we know that we have a warmer climate. In New York State, we're 4.4 degrees warmer in the winter than we were in 1970. But we also have a lot of other things going on. We have these fragmented bits of land and forest. We have an adulterated environment. Dr. Bruto went into this very well, so I won't go too much more. But it's different out there. It's unbalanced. Too many mice, not enough foxes to gobble them up. And what do you have? You put all these things together, and we have all the pieces in place for an epidemic. Over here on the right, what you see are migratory pathways for birds. Because not only do deer move ticks around, birds are moving them around. And so, for example, and they, by the way, have been moving ticks around for eons, you know, from the tip of Argentina in the south to the Yukon in the north. But in the past, when a tick might have been picked up, say, in Virginia and dropped in Nova Scotia, it didn't have as much chance of survival. Meeting up with people with other ticks just like itself, of making more babies, of finding these little mammals in the environment, of finding climate conditions that were suited to its survival. Now it does. We've actually had, just on the climate change aspect of it, scientists, God bless them, who have climbed the Alps. And 40 years ago, a scientist climbed to 800 meters. That was as high as he found ticks surviving in an area of Eastern Europe. 40 years later, another scientist goes out and finds them at 1,200 meters. We have a couple of studies just like that show they are moving not only latitudinally, but altitudinally. They're moving up. So, the other thing about this epidemic, we've touched on it a little, is that we're not done yet. We don't know the full dimensions of it. It is still unfolding. And I show you here what looks like a nice little blade of grass with what seems to be a seed pod on top of it. And no, those are actually hundreds of these little larval ticks. And it's that new tick in town called H. longicornis, or the Asian long-horned tick. And it's the first tick to be identified in the United States in 80 years. How did it get here? We don't know. What's it going to do? We don't know that either. But if you scrape up against that little blade of grass, this is what happens. Boom, they explode. Right onto you, all over. The other thing is we have other ticks, such as the Lone Star tick. Now, the Lone Star tick loves hot, steamy weather. It has been a survivor. It has long inhabited Georgia and the Carolinas and been very happy there. And now, all of a sudden, we're finding it is moving north. It's all over Long Island. It has been found as far north, I think, as Maine, and maybe a sighting or two in Canada. But the other thing is, we've discovered it is capable of doing something else. You get bitten by this tick, and 6 or 7 weeks later, you have a hamburger, and you perhaps go into anaphylactic shock, you have a vicious allergic response. And it took a while, but it was traced to a molecule in the saliva of the Lone Star tick. What's also interesting about this, though, is there was a woman allergist in Australia who was taking note of this at the same time that a group in Virginia was all of a sudden seeing these cases of this crazy allergy that they had never seen before, that they couldn't trace to anything. And it was Dr. Van Noonen in Australia who actually figured out that it was caused by the bite of a tick. The point of this is how global in nature this is. But, you know, it's not just Lyme disease. So quickly, I'm just going to go through what a group of scientists from Columbia University found when they caught some ticks around Long Island Sound on both sides, in Connecticut and in Long Island. And they just found lots of, you know, yucky stuff. The prime reason why my friend here, Dr. Ken Liegner, calls ticks cesspools of infection. Yes, Lyme was in about 56%, but we've also got other things, anaplasmosis, babesiosis, we know about Borrelia miyamotoi, an up-and-coming infection. We don't really know how to test for it and diagnose it. And it is in increasing numbers of ticks. There was a story in the Syracuse paper just this week of new reports of what they're calling BMD. Powassan virus, which can be fatal in a fair number of cases. It's rare, luckily, but it also can be transmitted within 15 minutes of a tick bite. So this is something you don't want to get. This is the other thing, filarial nematode, that's a kind of worm, lovely, and 14 viruses, so lots of stuff. Also complicating the picture is that we have a lot more types of Borrelia burgdorferi spirochetes out there in the larger, sense. So far to date, we have 22 species that have been identified, and the ones in red are the ones that we know can cause some sort of illness. So if you get this spirochete in the particular tick that bites you, again, it might not be picked up in our classic tests. Okay, so this is global. Now I'm just going to go through some of the ways in which we know this is global. And Europe, the European Parliament has said this is alarming. We're seeing perhaps 650,000 to 850,000 cases a year, with the true burden really unknown because they're not very good at counting country to country. But I will tell you this, I just came back from Europe. I was at a conference in Prague, and the people there have every bit as difficult a problem in getting diagnosed and getting care as we do here in the United States. And by the way, it's our fault because the IDSA guidelines basically rule in the day almost everywhere, in almost every country around the world. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But okay, so this is just a series of slides of where Lyme disease is. These are signs at trailheads and in parks in countries throughout Europe. This comes from a study that was published in a Chinese journal, where you have a society that's not terribly open and frank, but underdiagnosis of early Lyme disease and physical damage and an advanced stage are a huge problem. That was a study of 800 residents of a suburb of Beijing. So it's there too. It's in Australia, where they haven't quite identified the pathogen that's involved, but there is something, a Lyme-like illness, and lots of people are suffering. So now to just get to me as a journalist. I was a journalist for 30 plus years, an investigative journalist, I wrote lots of stories over these years, lots of different topics, social justice, municipal corruption, conditions in local prisons and jails. And I wrote a lot of stories, a lot of series of articles. This is me, by the way, sort of bookends of my career. I'm 29 in that first picture on the left, and I'm a little older in the other one. And, you know, I came at Lyme disease as the ultimate outsider. Just a journalist who really wanted to learn about it, who lived in an area where I knew it was a problem, and that's how, frankly, I get ideas for my stories. I'm observant of the community and the society around me. So I wanted to look at Lyme disease. But I had nobody in my family who had chronic Lyme disease. I don't have chronic Lyme disease. That's how I came at this. And as I said, I've written stories about these kinds of things, about, you know, crooks in government, and stories I've written that have actually resulted in people sometimes getting fired, and in at least one case getting indicted. And, you know, these are the kinds of things that gets an investigative reporter's juices flowing, you know, bad government, that kind of stuff. I did not expect this in Lyme disease, not at all. I was quite surprised. So this is a map that ran with my first article. And basically what I started by doing is looking at 3,000 counties worth of data for the United States over a period of 5 years, and then I ranked all of these counties for their Lyme disease incidence. And wow, I discovered that 5 of the top 10 counties in the country were right where I was reporting from, the mid-Hudson Valley. That's why we're all in that red. And you will also notice that here, you guys are in the less than, the southern tier is in the less than 10%, 10 per 100,000 rate of Lyme disease. At that time, this is a few years ago, and the other map I showed you has them at 100. So 10-fold increase in the rate of Lyme disease. So anyway, this is what I discovered. I'm like, wow, I gotta keep going with this story. What's going on here? So then I continue on with my reporting, and I'm really surprised at the change in my direction. All of a sudden, I'm writing about antibiotics, and I'm writing about doctors. And I'm like, okay, here we are in an area of the nation with the highest Lyme disease rates. But the powers that be, what are they concerned about? They're not really working too hard on getting ticks out of the environment. They're not really concerned about these patients who have to go to 5 and 10 doctors to get care. What their focus is, it's on antibiotics. It's on doctors. I found in that story that there were 5 doctors at that time who were under investigation by the state licensing board. Why? Because of how they treat Lyme disease. These, by the way, were the doctors who were trying to help, who were trying to figure out this disease, who'd been abandoned, whose patients had been abandoned by medicine. So, basically, I went from there to discovery of what these myths were about Lyme disease. And the first, it's been discussed before, that the Lyme disease test works. You can, you know, rely on it. It will tell you sooner or later if you have Lyme disease. And this is a chart from one of my first reports as well, in which we see, you know, kind of graphically portrayed the various stages of illness and the performance of the test. So the test is really, really lousy early on, when, by the way, most of us go to the doctor because we're sick and we want to get diagnosed, we want to get treated. Gets a little better as we go on, but just bear in mind that asterisk, poor studies. These are based on the studies of Lyme disease tests. I'll talk about that in a second. But this is a quote from someone in the CDC who referred to the test quite accurately as complex, technically demanding, difficult to interpret. It's a tough test to perform, to read, and it's also a tough test to meet the standards of, namely to pass it and be declared positive when you have the illness. It's arbitrary in terms of what it counts and what it doesn't. You know, in the later stages of illness, on the antibody strip on the Western blot, you have to get 5 of 10 markers. You get 4, you don't count. You're a little bit pregnant, kind of, but not really. So anyway, what they decide to count, what they don't count, is important. It also requires waiting. Yeah, it does get somewhat better as we go along, but that also means we are allowing that Lyme disease spirochete to leave your bloodstream, to go where it will. We saw in the mouse study, which I found really interesting, the various places it was showing up. It has shown up in those places in people. It goes to the brain, it goes to the heart, it goes to the eyes, it goes to the joints, it goes to the muscles. But the other thing about that chart right there, which purports to say that it does eventually work, is that it's based on these studies that they have done on the Lyme disease test. And if we don't have a good frame of reference against which to judge these tests, how do we really know if they work? We don't have a good culture test, for example, for Lyme disease. That would be a gold standard. So there was a study done in which 21 researchers looked at 78 studies. They tried to figure out how well done these studies were done. They found that every single one of them had a high risk of bias. And this was their overall conclusion. The data do not provide sufficient evidence to make inferences about the value of the tests for clinical practice. That's a little bit of science speak, but it generally means we can't say if these tests work when a doctor uses them on a patient. 78 studies. All right, here's one reason, among many, why this matters. This is a boy by the name of Joseph Ilone, and in 2015, Joseph went to a summer camp in Rhode Island. He's from Poughkeepsie, where I reported. And he had a fabulous 2 weeks. He learned all about nature. He came home fired up, wanting to clean up the environment, wanting to study more about how to do that. And then he got sick. And his parents were very concerned. They took him to a pediatrician twice. He was tested for Lyme disease. He tested negative, and he was not treated. Shortly thereafter, he collapsed on his front lawn, and he died within hours. The Lyme disease spirochete had gone to Joseph's heart. It had stopped it from functioning properly. So his pediatrician was asked in a wrongful death lawsuit, what's the significance to you as a treating doctor of the fact that the antibody test was negative for Lyme? And the answer, that he didn't have Lyme at that time. The doctor wasn't even aware that early on the test doesn't work. She believed it, and she did not treat him. Now, Joseph's death led to a very important report in the medical literature in which they tell the story, and they warn other physicians that this can happen, that Lyme can go to the heart and kill a 17-year-old. But at the end we see here, it says, here we report a rare example of fatal Lyme carditis. Now, I would argue, and I think a lot of other folks who know about this disease and how it works would argue, that it may not be so rare. Nobody looks for this. In all of reported medical literature to this point, there were 4 cases of fatal Lyme carditis. 5 months later, 10 miles away, another man died, dropped dead, of Lyme carditis. Thereafter, a pathologist at a transplant clinic in Atlanta decided to go back and look at some tissue samples, and he found 2 more cases. There's a lot more out there than we are reporting. We also don't look for Lyme deaths. It is very likely that more people die of Lyme disease than are actually recorded as having died of Lyme disease or of causes related to it. I did a study of 1 million death certificates in New York State. Over a 13-year period, I found 9 Lyme disease deaths. There's a lot more than that going on. I think we can count on it. Okay, as far as the test, we've gone through this, but you get the rash, you know, so you don't have to worry that the Lyme test doesn't work early, because you will have the rash, and we can, it is diagnostic. And the CDC has said for way too long, in the absence of the rash, serologic analysis is required to confirm the diagnosis. Now they do every now and then put something up on their website very quietly that it's, you know, where you can't really find it, that it can be a clinical diagnosis, but docs have not gotten that message. In other words, it can be diagnosed by symptoms. You can use your judgment. So, reasons not to wait on this disease. We've kind of covered some of this. It disseminates, it moves around the body. It's a nasty bug. It disables your germinal centers, for one, and it has other just magical ways of basically shutting off or curbing the ability of your immune system to respond to it. It changes shape, it goes into those little cystic forms, it hides, it goes under biofilms. It, under stress, basically says, ooh, I gotta get out of here, I gotta go into hiding. It waits for the coast to be clear, for your, maybe for your immune system to sort of settle down, and then it comes out again. I spoke to a researcher at the University of California, Davis, who's done some great mouse studies of Lyme disease and how it persists in the mouse model. And he said to me, Borrelia is a really, really interesting microorganism. It has a huge brain. It outsmarts people. He is in awe of this bacteria. So the other myth of Lyme disease is that we can cure it. And Holly showed you some early studies of how we proved that we can cure Lyme disease, studies that were full of holes. Well, this one, and this is just one of so many examples, is much more recent. So, in 2019, one of these very, very well-known names in Lyme disease, Gary Wormser, did a study. And he used 14 days of amoxicillin on patients who had had the Lyme disease rash. And okay, so he publishes his paper, and he says, highly effective, well tolerated, uniformly successful in resolving the rash. So far, so good. Okay. No patient developed an objective manifestation of Lyme disease. Hugely successful, right? Objective, remember that word. Oh, by the way, far down in the study, it says, evidence of PTLDS, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, was found for 16.7% of the 24 subjects. But to Dr. Wormser and his co-authors, that wasn't a problem, because it was subjective symptoms, because there were no objective symptoms, at least that he could find, and because nobody got a rash. The rash went away. So this is basically what we have been saying for a very long time. He just really repeated the stuff we already know. And he repeated it in a way that has been said before. The treatments work. For a long time, the Centers for Disease Control has acknowledged that 10 to 20% of patients who are treated for Lyme disease in the classic way will have lingering symptoms of all sorts of things, pain, fatigue, joint muscle aches. That's not really a very small number of people, is it? I mean, we're talking 40 to 80,000 people in 2017. And as Holly noted, that's among the early treated. What about the people whose cases aren't caught early? We can double, maybe triple that number. And we are further finding that people in the late treated stage or people whose symptoms don't resolve have severe problems. At Johns Hopkins University, they've done studies of people with what we call post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, which is a pretty bad way of describing what is likely a chronic illness, what is a chronic illness, but the jury may be out whether it's chronic infection or at least whether chronic infection is the total cause of these problems. But it found a high percentage of people who had PTLDS had neurocognitive problems, fatigue, sleep problems, widespread pain. This is real. They can study, at least they can measure the quality of life of people with these symptoms, and it's far lower than the general population. But moreover, it's not only, these what might be called subjective symptoms. How do you measure somebody's sleep disturbance? How do you measure somebody's fatigue? We are seeing, as Holly already showed you, that there is real damage that is being documented. And by the way, they do these PET scans on players in the NFL to see how badly damaged their brains are from what they do. And on the left, we see these very happy yellow brains with, the sun is shining. And on the right, and that's my very scientific analysis, by the way. And on the right, we see these, brains that show a lot of widespread and serious inflammation. So one of the problems here, and how we got into this, is how longer-term antibiotic treatment for Lyme disease has been demonized. We've drawn this line on anything more than a month, maybe two, of antibiotics for Lyme disease, even though we know antibiotics are among the safest drugs there are, even though they are used long-term for a lot of things, like a urinary tract infection, like acne, like tuberculosis. They're used in higher doses, just like Lyme doctors might do. So I wrote this article for Newsday, and I also discussed this in my book, on the risks of longer-term antibiotic treatment for Lyme disease. I wanted to see where the evidence was. So I went to the website of the Centers for Disease Control, where they've posted the literature that exists, at least, on these poor outcomes for patients who have been subjected to longer terms of antibiotics for Lyme disease. Well, in a period of covering 21 years, all the CDC could come up with was 6 studies. 4 of these studies were on individual cases. And yes, there were some bad outcomes. There were a couple of deaths when you use intravenous treatment. There are risks. But to me, the risks have been greatly exaggerated and a line arbitrarily drawn on Lyme disease. So, is anybody asking why we have this problem? And yes, luckily, we do have people asking questions. And this is Monica Embers, who Holly mentioned before, who runs the primate lab at Tulane University in New Orleans. And she's done fabulous work. And her poor little rhesus monkeys, these tiny little monkeys, who she puts ticks onto to really infect them in the way that we would get infected. She infects them. She lets a little time pass. She does things like, try and test them to see if they test positive, even knowing that they have been infected. She has had cases where monkeys cannot muster any antibody response, which might explain why some of us don't test positive. She also treats them, and then she wants to see what happens. Are they still sick? do they still harbor the Lyme disease spirochete? And she euthanizes them. And she has found Lyme disease spirochetes spread widely throughout their bodies, in their brains, in their organs, in their tissues. Another player here who's doing some great research, again, Holly mentioned Dr. Zhang, and I'll go quickly also to Dr. Lewis. Dr. Zhang is at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Lewis at Northeastern. And one of the things that they have done, beyond what Holly mentioned, is that they take the Lyme disease spirochete in test tubes and petri dishes, and they throw everything at it in the FDA library of drugs, mainly of antibiotics, and they see what is most effective. And what we're learning is the frontline antibiotics that we use for Lyme disease aren't terribly high on this list in terms of effectiveness. Monica Embers believes doxycycline is a bad drug from the get-go for Lyme disease because of the way it works. Doesn't work very well on slowly dividing bacteria, which is what Lyme disease is. It only replicates every 18 hours. So this is what we've been told for a very long time. Lots of denial. The bigger epidemic is Lyme anxiety. And that was actually in that New York Times story that Holly reported on when it released the report on the prophylactic doses. Okay, so here is the upshot of this dogma that has long pervaded Lyme disease, that we can diagnose it, that we can treat it. First of all, it takes longer for people to be diagnosed. This is the MyLyme data study. I would urge people in this room to sign up for MyLyme data, because what they're basically trying to do is a big data approach to Lyme disease. This is, you'll find this at lymedisease.org. And they're trying to see what works for patients, how far they have to go for treatment, how much they spend, how much time they lose from work. But the bottom line is we're trying to see what might be a model for Lyme disease care, what works for people out in the population. So 36% of people taking 6 years or more for diagnosis, to another 20%, so that comes up to 56% more than two years to get diagnosed. And the number of doctors they have to see. 35% have to see more than 10 doctors before they get a diagnosis. I just came back from Canada. In Vancouver, I spoke to a Lyme disease group, and I came across this in my preparation for the presentation I did there. And it's a really interesting report. The Canadian government decided to look in 2010 at Lyme disease, and some really good researcher did a very nice report summing up the risks of Lyme disease and the things we need to do and the things we need to look for. And you know, he's talking here about the rate of infection, he's talking about actual number of cases is undoubtedly higher than we know, and it may be increasing, and we really have to be careful for this. And then he goes on to say that bacterial persistence is an issue, and it's been documented in the medical literature for a long time, and this might be causing problems for people who have been infected with Lyme disease. Well, you'll see there, not for distribution. On every page of this report, it says not for distribution. It was not released, and it's kind of your standard, summary of what's going on in Lyme disease with that, persistence word mentioned. We're not supposed to mention it. So it was never released until somebody in the Lyme community filed a Freedom of Information request. This is the result of our dogmatic way of treating Lyme disease. We have made doctors afraid to diagnose Lyme disease. You walk in with a complex case of Lyme disease, and the doctor wants to run the other way because they don't know what to do about it, and they've been told what not to do about it. And they have seen their colleagues called on the carpet for breaking the rules of Lyme disease. Lyme disease has become a controversy as much as it is an epidemic, and that's what we need to change. So, this no big deal attitude toward Lyme disease has led to this. In the entire database, clinicaltrials.gov, run by the National Institutes of Health, you will find 70 studies pertaining to Lyme disease. AIDS, 11,000 studies. They both were identified, both pathogens, by the way, in the early 80s, 2 years apart. Lyme first, then the HIV virus. And I'm not saying Lyme disease is AIDS, but I'm saying it deserves a heck of a lot more attention than it's gotten. Currently, there's 26 studies and 1,500 for AIDS, which, by the way, we've more or less figured out, right? We know how to treat AIDS, we know how to keep it in check, we know how to keep people well. And this just says what I said in another way. We just don't have much money allocated for Lyme disease. About $70 per patient, compared to $77,000 for AIDS. Even for West Nile virus, we're putting up $13,000 per patient per year for research. We have about 2,000 cases of West Nile virus. And the reason we're doing that is because there are deaths from West Nile virus. There's about 130 deaths a year. I would venture to say that the Lyme disease toll is every bit as high and likely much higher. Again, another way to say what I just said, we see the number of clinical trials for hepatitis C, for flu, for malaria, for all sorts of things. Much more resources put toward them than toward Lyme disease. Okay, there are some reasons to hope in this picture. We have nonprofit groups that are coming up with money, groups like Bay Area Lyme and Global Lyme Alliance and the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, and they're funding research like Monica Embers, like Dr. Zhang's. And that, by the way, is leading to treatments that are coming to the fore and are actually being tried in clinical practice right now. There's the task force, the tick-borne disease working group in DC, which is in its second round and is promising, I think. There's another thing that has emerged in 2017. A group of Lyme disease patients filed a lawsuit. And this lawsuit was filed against the Infectious Diseases Society of America, against 7 of their key researcher physicians who basically have kind of come up with this model of care, and against 8 insurance companies. There's also worldwide demand for change. But let me just talk a little bit about the lawsuit. And this is your list on the right of the defendants in the lawsuit. And basically, it is contending that the IDSA, that these researchers and the insurance companies conspired in a couple of ways. They conspired to kind of corner the marketplace for Lyme disease care, to drive the doctors out of business who didn't agree with the way that they wanted Lyme disease treated. They also conspired in a way that involved money. And this remains to be proven. I think the former is easy to prove, that they have basically tried to corner the market on Lyme disease. Now, whether they were actually paid by the insurance companies has to be proven in a court of law. It may happen, I don't know. But this is just one page from this lawsuit. And if you want to read this lawsuit, it is on my website, along with a lot of other documents from the lawsuit itself. They can be downloaded. But this is, just one page among many that I think many of you would find really interesting and gratifying to read, because it will reflect your reality, I think. And in the 1990s, the insurers decided that treatment was too expensive for Lyme disease. They red flagged it. They made it an effort to deny coverage for treatment of Lyme. And further, they paid these panelists to both fashion guidelines that worked for them and to deny claims. And right now, in the lawsuit, they're having a battle over documents. The plaintiffs, the Tory side, these are all the patients who are involved, are fighting the IDSA and the insurance companies to give over the documents that may show what money changed hands. There is some evidence of money changing hands, which is mentioned in the original complaint. They need a lot more to show a pattern. So that's hopeful. This is also a really great development in this fight against dogma. And what we see here are lists of diagnostic codes. Every few years, the World Health Organization puts out the International Classification of Diseases. And this is the old one on the left. We see 4 diagnoses for Lyme disease. This is the new one, which hasn't yet taken effect. It takes a couple of years. But there's 16 there. So this is really great. Dr. Ligner was intimately involved in developing this a document that was presented in Geneva by a bunch of him and other like-minded people. Holly, you were there, right? They all did a lot of work, and they deserve a round of applause. We'll give it to them later. But the only bad thing about this otherwise wonderful list is that one of these diagnoses were dropped. Where is it? Oh, here, this one. Belatedly. It was really very mysterious. The 55,000 new diagnostic codes were put up, and then a month or two later, congenital Lyme borreliosis disappeared from the list. And just why remains a mystery, but it also makes the point, as Sue has made, that there is huge denial of this, that it's a very touchy subject. It increases the implications of Lyme disease hugely. If a mom can pass it on to her kids, boy, that's a big deal. But it's not on there yet. The other thing also touched on by Holly is that folks are starting to own up a little bit. The test has shortcomings. It cannot distinguish active or past infection. Reliable methods are lacking. And that's a study that was published about a year ago, and it was signed on to by major players in the Lyme disease world. So, antibiotics to me aren't the answer here. We're just not asking the right question. Recognition that there's a problem is what we need to do. We need to do more research. Yes, antibiotics play a role. I mean, they're one of the key things that we have to deal with this disease right now. But let's figure out what is the problem and what's the solution. Start doing those studies. Start controlling ticks in the environment. So this is me about 30 years ago standing this high in grass. Do you think I would do that today? Holding a baby? So we all have to have a new relationship with nature. And this is where I get to show you my 4 grandsons. And I learned last night I'm having a 5th grandson. I wanted a girl, but anyway. So, and the reason I show this is because children are the most frequently infected. Kids 5 to 9 years old, right there, along with us old folks. But we got to protect our kids. Consider permethrin impregnated clothing. It not only repels, it kills, and you don't have to put it on every time. There's other things we can do. But you just got to be your own advocate. You have to get informed, and if you think you have Lyme disease, you insist on testing, and if the test doesn't work and you still think you have it, insist on treatment. Permethrin fact sheet, you can find that online, and that's it for me. Thanks.